Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be firing off the cannonballs in the forward direction of the camera and the cannonball itself. So if I hit space, you can see that I can actually start to aim this ball at objects and try and hit objects in the distance, which is a lot more fun. Yes, I got that chair. It's a lot more fun than it was previously. Let's dive in and see how to do this. So we're going to be using something called a forward vector, but what is it? So I've just, on the sake of argument on this slide, put in an X and Y directions, just like we would have in the viewport to keep things grounded in that reality. And we can imagine we've got our camera here that is the player's camera, that when we rotate the mouse, it's turning around. And we're spawning it now our projectile, and the newly spawned projectile is getting the correct rotation from the camera. So you can see this as I've depicted it on the slide. Now, the forward vector would be essentially the rotated X direction. So it is basically a vector that points in the forward direction after you have rotated it. So you can see this projectile has been rotated around and its forward direction is over here rather than being off back towards the back of the camera, because of the rotation that we've given it from the player pawn's control rotation. Now, we can actually get a right vector as well, which is essentially the y-axis that's been rotated, but we're not going to be using that because all we're interested in is sending the projectile in that forward direction. And what's interesting about the vectors that come back from get forward vector and from get right vector is that they have a length of 1. This can be guaranteed they're always going to have a length of 1. And this is really useful because if we want to apply a certain amount of impulse in this direction, all we need to do is multiply this vector to give us the direction by the value that we want, such as 400 if that's the velocity you want to give it. So enough talk. How do we actually achieve this in Blueprint? So what we need to do is query that newly spawned projectile. We've given it the correct rotation over here before we spawned it, and it's been spawned with the correct rotation. We could see that when we play the game. So we need to get its forward vector. So to do that, we can either pull off of the actor reference itself, so the reference to the BP projectile, which comes out of the spawn actor node, or we could do it from the static mesh component. Either one would work just fine. I'm going to do it from the actor just to save on nodes and keep things a little bit tidier. So what we're going to do here is type in get forward vector. And we can see two options here. I'm going to be using the get actor forward vector, but both would actually give you the same result. And then we've got ourselves the vector value. Now, if we plug this directly into the impulse, we aren't going to see much of an effect. If we go ahead and hit play, and we spawn a projectile, you can see it just drops straight down. And the reason for that is that the length of this vector is going to be 1, which, as we know, because of Unreal units, that's in centimeters, so it's giving us 1 centimeter per second, which is a pretty puny velocity. So what we need to be able to do is multiply this vector by a float. Fortunately, we can do that fairly straightforwardly in Blueprint. We can drag off of the return value for this forward vector, and we can type multiply. And that gives us this multiply operator node. And you see by default what it wants to do is it wants to multiply a vector by a vector, but that's not what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, we can change that by right-clicking on the second input node. We can click convert pin, and we can convert the pin to a float. And that gives us the correct type of multiplication that we want. So I'd like to challenge you to do this multiply vector for yourself. So plug in the multiplication node to both the input and the output to the impulse. And how much do you need to multiply by to get a force that you are happy with? Pause the video and have a go. Hello and welcome back. So we're going to, I've already been using a value of about, I think we said about 400, and then I'm going to plug in the output from the multiplication into the input for the impulse. So what we're getting is a vector that is 400 units long and is pointing in the direction, the forward direction of our BP projectile with the way it's rotated, and that is also the same direction as our camera. So let's go ahead and hit play. And when we fire, you can see that it is firing off in the right direction, but with not quite enough force. So I'm going to increase this by make it 1000. Let's try with 1000. Okay, we're getting something a lot better now that we can actually start to enjoy. I think we had actually 4,000. I think I'm just misremembering. If we go ahead and play now with 4,000, you can see a projectile that's a lot more fun to fire. And the final thing that I want to do is, because we don't need to know its rotation anymore, and it kind of looks weird that it's this elongated shape, I want to go back into the BP projectile editor, selecting the static mesh component, go into the details pane, and I'm just going to set the scale back to 0.5 like all of the other elements there, which gives us the ball back to being spherical. And if we go ahead and hit play now, we've got a nice little cannonball, which is actually a lot of fun to fire at objects and cause a little bit of destruction. Great stuff. We've achieved a lot in this lecture by applying that get forward vector node. I'll see you in the next one.